There comes a moment on the path of inner transformation when the self you thought you were begins to crumble. The persona you've polished for years, the name, the status, the roles, they begin to feel hollow. That moment is called ego death, and although terrifying, it is one of the most sacred thresholds the human psyche can cross. It is not the death of you, but the death of illusion. Not the destruction of self, but the revelation of truth. It's the rebirth of your most authentic being. Let me take you into the depths of what really happens, not just to the brain, but to the soul. When the ego dissolves, when the ego begins to dissolve, the first and most jarring experience is the shattering of illusion. It is a psychological earthquake, not visible to the outside world, but internally. It feels as though the very structure of your identity is collapsing. Everything you thought was solid, your beliefs, your self-image, your opinions, even your ambitions, begins to fall apart. You no longer recognize yourself in the mirror of your own mind. This is not madness, though it may feel like it. It is the beginning of clarity. The ego, for all its usefulness, is fundamentally a mask, a survival structure built from childhood experiences, social conditioning, and inherited narratives. It keeps you functioning, achieving, comparing, and defending. But it also keeps you disconnected from your soul, your truth, and the deeper currents of reality. As the illusion shatters, your brain's default pathways, especially those rooted in self-referential thought, begin to quiet. The default mode network, often associated with our inner chatter and constructed sense of self, starts to deactivate. You begin to see things as they are, not as your ego wants them to be. The illusion that you must always be right, that you must be liked, that your worth is defined by your success. All of it begins to lose power. This process is terrifying to the ego because it interprets collapse as death. And in a way, it is a kind of death, but only for the false. The structures built to protect you now feel like cages. The identity you've curated becomes too small, too restrictive. What once felt like you now feels like a costume you've worn for too long. This shattering brings disorientation. You may feel lost, confused, or emotionally raw. But underneath that disorientation lies something liberating, the truth that you are not your achievements, not your roles, not your past. What breaks apart is not you, but the idea of you. And what remains is the open space where authenticity can begin. This is the threshold where real transformation begins. It is not a step backward. It is a necessary descent into the unknown, where the fragments of the ego are scattered so that the deeper self may rise. Only when illusion dies can truth be born. Only when the mask falls can the face be seen. When the ego falls silent, even momentarily, something ancient and often feared begins to rise from within. The shadow. It is the collection of all that you have rejected, denied, or deemed unworthy within yourself. These are not foreign elements, they are you. Your rage, your envy, your unmet needs, your suppressed desires, your grief, your guilt. All the emotions and instincts that your conscious mind deemed inappropriate or dangerous to express. As long as the ego is strong and in control, the shadow remains buried, hidden behind socially acceptable behavior reliefs. But with the ego's dissolution, the gatekeeping function of the psyche falters, and the unconscious, long silenced, begins to speak, and it does not whisper, it roars. This emergence can be terrifying. You may suddenly find yourself overwhelmed by feelings you thought you had outgrown, or urges you never wanted to admit. You may feel shame, confusion, or fear as these parts of yourself rise to the surface. But this is not a breakdown. This is a breakthrough. For the first time, you are confronting your whole self, not just the version you present to the world. The brain begins to process memories and emotions it previously locked away. Old traumas may resurface not to hurt you again, but to be healed. Neurobiologically, this can create a storm, a flood of limbic system activity, heightened emotional sensitivity, and a collapse of the ego's regulatory grip. But this storm is sacred. It clears the debris of repression and makes space for reintegration. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not evil. It is simply unconscious, and what is unconscious controls us from the dark. By facing it, by holding it in awareness without judgment, we reclaim lost energy, buried strength, and hidden truth. The anger we feared can become assertiveness. The jealousy can point us to unmet desires. The grief can open the heart. The parts we thought made us weak are often the key to our power. This confrontation with the shadow is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing relationship. But the ego death creates the rupture necessary for it to begin. You start to realize that what you ran from in yourself was never your enemy. It was your teacher. The parts you disowned are not obstacles to growth, they are the growth. When the shadow emerges, it does so not to destroy you, but to show you what has been abandoned. It invites you to become whole, not perfect, but whole. And wholeness is where true peace lies, not in purity but in integration, not in denying the dark, but in bringing light to it. This is the moment you begin to understanding what rises from the darkness is not here to haunt you. It is here to heal you. After the storm of ego death and the emergence of the shadow, the psyche enters a subtle but powerful phase, a kind of sacred reconstruction. This is where the concept of neuroplastic rebirth becomes vital, both psychologically and neurologically. Neuroplasticity is the brain's errant ability to rewire itself, to form new neural pathways, to adapt, and ultimately, to transform. When the ego collapses and the old identity loses its grip, the brain is no longer bound to repeat the same habitual thought patterns. The conditioned loops, fear-based reactions, self-critical thoughts, defensive behaviors, begin to dissolve. You are no longer reinforcing the same neurocircuitry that once kept you in psychological bondage. The collapse of these networks doesn't mean your mind is broken. It means it is finally free to change. This creates a space for something entirely new to form. New neural pathways are built not from fear, but from presence. Not from reaction, but from reflection. You begin to think differently, feel differently, and relate to yourself and the world in ways that are more aligned with truth and wholeness. Slowly, your brain begins to support not the illusion of control, but the freedom of awareness. As the default mode network quiets, the region of the brain associated with the ego and repetitive self-referential thinking, other areas light up. The parts responsible for compassion, creativity, interconnectedness, and even spiritual insight become more active. You may find that your thoughts become less rigid, your reactions less automatic. Emotional responses that once hijacked your system start to lose their grip. You gain space, the sacred psychological space between stimulus and response. And in that space is the power of choice. From a Jungian lens, this is the process of individuation made biological. The psyche seeks to become whole, and the brain, when freed from the tyranny of ego, follows suit. You are no longer operating from a fragmented sense of self but from a deeper, more unified awareness. The unconscious begins to integrate into the conscious mind, and new levels of insight arise. Not as abstract knowledge but as embodied wisdom. During this phase, even your perception of time, relationships, and meaning can shift. You begin to realize that you are not just a collection of memories, fears, and goals. You are a living, breathing presence capable of evolving beyond your past. Each day becomes an opportunity not to repeat who you were, but to consciously shape who you are becoming. This neuroplastic rebirth does not happen all at once. It is not a dramatic event but a sacred unfolding. It requires care, patience, and often silence. The mind must be nourished with new thoughts. The soul must be watered with reflection and stillness. The nervous system must be given time to settle, to trust, to grow. In this quiet reconstruction, you become the conscious architect of your inner world. You are no longer unconsciously wired by survival. You are consciously rewiring toward truth, purpose, and peace. And with every new connection formed, a deeper truth sets in. You are not fixed. You are not finished. You are being reborn, from the inside out. As the ego recedes and the inner architecture of the self begins to transform, a profound shift occurs in perception. The dissolution of duality. This is not merely a poetic idea but a deeply experiential reality. The mind, once conditioned to divide everything into opposites, good and bad, right and wrong, self and other, light and dark, begins to relax its grip on these categories. And when this happens, you begin to see life not through the lens of conflict and contrast, but through the deeper, unifying essence that underlies all things. Duality is a function of the ego. The ego survives by defining itself against something else. I am this, not that. I am better than this person, or worse than that one. I am successful, which means others must be failing. These opposites are how the ego finds identity, safety, and purpose. It separates to define, it judges to feel secure, it compares to feel real. But once the ego collapses, this dividing function no longer holds the same power. The brain begins to shift from its habitual binary thinking, from black and white patterns, toward a more integrated and flexible cognition. You start to notice subtleties, Paradox begins to feel not like a threat, but like a doorway. You begin to see that joy and sorrow are not opposites, but twin notes in the same chord. That strength and vulnerability can coexist within the same breath. That you can be both healing and whole, both broken and divine. This dissolving of duality often brings an overwhelming sense of peace. Not because everything is suddenly perfect, but because you stop demanding perfection. You begin to hold space for contradictions, within yourself and others, without needing to resolve them. The mind no longer insists on tidy answers. The heart no longer rebels against uncertainty. There is a quiet surrender to the mystery of life. This experience aligns with what Carl Jung, the transcendent function, the psychic mechanism that brings opposites together into a new, unified state. When this function is activated, the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche begin to dialogue, not battle. The masculine and feminine within you stop competing and begin to collaborate. The wounded inner child and the wise inner adult begin to walk together. In neurological terms, this may coincide with more balanced hemispheric activity in the brain, a greater harmony between the analytical left brain and the intuitive right brain. The rigid boundaries between thought and feeling, logic and intuition, start to soften. Your mind becomes more holistic. You no longer feel torn between inner extremes, but more grounded in an inner center that can hold them both. The dissolution of duality also softens your relationship with the world. You begin to see yourself in others, and others in yourself. Compassion deepens not as a moral obligation, but as a natural expression of this unified awareness. You no longer need to prove your worth by separating yourself. You belong, not because you fit into a mold, but because you are life itself, unfolding uniquely through your being. And perhaps most radically, you begin to understand that there is no final destination, no absolute enlightenment, no perfect state to arrive at. The journey itself becomes the teacher, the dance between light and shadow, joy and pain, effort and grace. This dance is the transformation. You begin to live not from a need to escape duality, but from the deep knowing that duality was never real to begin with. In this state, peace is not something you chase. It is something you uncover, layer by layer, as the walls of separation gently dissolve. You realize that wholeness is not the absence of contradiction, but the full embrace of it. And from that embrace your trust self begins to shine, not as one half of a divided world, but as a bridge between all things. After the shattering of illusion, the confrontation with the shadow, the neuroplastic rebirth, and the dissolution of duality, there comes a quiet, profound moment of return. Not a return to who you were, but a return to life with a completely transformed sense of self. This is the birth of a new identity, not a mask, not a role, but a way of being that is rooted in authenticity, wholeness, and deep inner truth. In the wake of ego death, you do not emerge with the same goals, the same fears, or even the same sense of time. What once drove you, validation, competition, approval, success as defined by others, now feels strangely hollow. The brain, having rewired itself through neuroplastic change, no longer finds pleasure in old habits of self-judgment, comparison, or performance. The craving for external achievement is replaced by a quiet longing for alignment. This new identity is not built, it is revealed. You do not manufacture it, you uncover it. Like an ancient sculpture hidden beneath layers of dust and time, what you find is not someone brand new, but someone real. Someone whole. Someone whose voice has always been speaking from beneath the noise, patiently waiting for the silence that follows ego's collapse. The new self does not seek to dominate or impress, but to express. You begin to speak from your center. Not from the mind's need to control, but from the soul's desire to communicate honestly. Your presence carries a different weight. People feel it. Not because you are louder, but because you are clearer. You no longer live to fulfill a role. You embody a purpose. With this return comes humility. You see yourself not as above others or below them, but as a mirror, capable of reflecting both the suffering and divinity within every being. You become less reactive and more responsive, less rigid and more fluid. You don't cling to identities or titles, because you understand they are tools, not truths. The new identity is not a fixed definition. It is an evolving presence, rooted in the freedom to be. You now live from what Jung would call the self, the totality of your conscious and unconscious psyche in alignment. The ego, no longer the ruler, becomes the servant. It helps you navigate the world without needing to control it. It supports expression without seeking dominance. It remembers your name, but no longer mistakes it for your essence. In this return, you realize that everything that once broke you, every loss, every failure, every fear, was a necessary part of your descent. Not to punish you but to open you. To strip away what was false so that what is eternal in you could rise. The identity you now wear is not armor. It is a second skin, soft and strong, born of experienced truth and integration. You become trustworthy to yourself. No longer split between the persona you show and the feelings you hide. Your inner and outer lives begin to align. You make decisions not from anxiety, but from intuition. You let go of relationships that feed your ego but starve your soul. You walk away from paths that once promised fame or comfort, because they no longer resonate with the person you've become. And perhaps most importantly, you accept your humanity. You no longer strive for perfection. You no longer apologize for your depth. You allow yourself to be seen, raw, real, and unfinished. Because now you know power is not in performance. It is in presence. This is the return. Not to who you once were, but to who you've always been beneath the noise. And from this place your true life begins. So if you feel like you're falling apart, if your identity feels like it's burning away, let it. The ego must dissolve for the self to rise. This is not your end. This is your becoming. You are not losing yourself. You are finally meeting yourself.